Today is the 3rd of December, the last ever seminar in this class. And how do you pronounce it? Joeri Bartels?
Yuri.
Yeah, all right. Presentation, something like happiness. Over to you, okay?
Right, thanks. Indeed, today I will be talking about the film Something Like Happiness. So this film came out in 2005. It was directed by Boden Slama, if I pronounce that correctly. So it's this kind of art house type film that explores the relations between like a group of like people in their 20s.
One slight interruption. I think I did mention it before in the introduction to the film. It is really, this is the first film that really deals with ordinary people really after the fall of communism, and goes out of Prague or whatever and looks at basically how people make a mess of their lives. And interestingly, I pointed out, I self-quote, that it was financed by German television and French Arte program, apart from some other money from the Czech Republic. But really, he had to go abroad in order to make something which was kind of defying the stereotypes, I think, which is quite interesting. But anyway, go on.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, so the film did get some critical acclaim. It won some prizes at film festivals. So what was the film about? Well, we got a bit of a slow start to the film where we are introduced to some of the main characters. We are introduced to Monica, who is a girl or like a woman in her early 20s. Her boyfriend moves to the US for personal ambition. We are introduced to Tony, who is a friend. He lives at this like decaying farm with his aunt, and we are introduced to Dasha, if I pronounce that right.
Yeah.
Very kind of, we immediately get displayed this very poor environment. She's a mother of two, single mother. We don't know that much about her, but we do know that she has some sort of mental illness. She's struggling a lot. She's always tired. She doesn't look very healthy. And this is a theme I will explore a bit more later on, but we will see this throughout the film, this kind of poverty, the hardship of life.
I will make yet another little interruption. Sorry about that. Quite interestingly, I spoke to Mr. Slama's wife, right, about this film. And she said that quite a lot in the film, not that is probably quite irrelevant, but was actually based on their personal experience. They apparently had some kind of relatives who was like Dasha, and they had to cope with it. And one other minor point, I mean, it's more almost, well, it's certainly 20 years since this film was made. Those two boys are Mr. Slama's sons. So anyway, go on.
Right, I didn't know that.
Yeah, no, you wouldn't. That's all right.
That's nice context. Right.
Sorry.
Where was I left?
I'll shut up now.
Yeah, so we get this display of poverty. We see some kind of very scenes where they interact with like their parents, and we see a display of kind of this everyday life. We see their struggles. We see kind of a struggle between like old generations and new generations. We see that, for instance, Tonic has moved out from his parents, who don't really approve of that decision. I would say they embrace the security more from their old home. Similarly with Monica, especially the father doesn't really approve of her relationship. I will explore this later on a bit more, but I think it's really important to note that we immediately see this kind of contrast between new and old world. And throughout the film, I think it moves quite slowly, but we see some life events happening. So, for instance, the aunt of Tony, she gets cancer and she dies, and we see how he struggles with this, how the kind of community around that deals with that. We see how all the characters try to take care for each other. For instance, for the kids of Dasha, who obviously is not taking care of them properly. We see how Tonic really kind of, I'm not sure if he falls in love or he was already in love, how that kind of goes on and how he deals with that. So we get a really kind of like intimate display of his everyday life and kind of like maybe like normal life events. Yeah, we see things about love, about sickness, family relations. So let's talk a bit more about the historical context of this movie. And for that, I think we need to go back to 1989. This is the year of the Velvet Revolution, or the revolution which ended the communist rule over Czechoslovakia. Of course, a time where more stuff was happening in Europe, and it was a product of student protests, which eventually led to mass demonstrations and led to the downfall of that state. And what happened was that there were free elections now, democratic elections, and we saw a shift towards capitalism, like a market economy. We saw a lot of privatization in this era. 1993 saw the Velvet Divorce, which is the split between Czechia and Slovakia. So I think the early 90s, there was definitely this sort of kind of optimism, but later on we see quite some struggles with this new era. So in 1979, I think this is quite important to understand this film. We see an economic crisis, or it was more like a monetary crisis, which also led to a political crisis. And to talk a bit more about that, this graph here shows the unemployment rates. So it's really evident that in the early 90s there was not that much unemployment, and this is kind of, I think, that was taken over from like the past. I read some things about it, and there's quite a couple of reasons to why this is. But very important here is that there's a very strong kind of incentive from the government to work. They're very big programs, as well as low wages, and these kind of things changed. One of the reasons there was a crisis because the monetary value of the thing was like very low, so it was very cheap. But eventually this ended, and there was some economic recession. So this led to a sort of kind of psychological effect as well in the Czech society, which I think, as far as I can understand, society still has still kind of showcases today. So to kind of make a contrast, I think it's important to understand that like during the communist era, there was a very strong common identity. There was not a lot of room for personal ambition, personal growth. I think the dominant narrative, there was a very important narrative that was kind of proposed from above. And after that fell away, people had the chance to kind of make own choices, be an individual. So I think this, I will explore this a little bit more later on, but this is really important in the film as well. What's also really important to note is that during the communist era, I wouldn't say like it was maybe super like welfare, but there was a sense of security. People had houses, a job, and this gradually fell away, as we see after the end of the communist state and the beginning of capitalism.
There's one interesting point, if I may again, sorry, I obviously can't sort of keep my mouth shut. It was actually under communism a criminal offense not to work, right? So basically everybody had to have some kind of job. I know there were some of these dissidents, not a very small, minuscule part of the nation, who were punished by being kind of removed from the intellectual jobs, and they spent sort of years as whatever, window cleaners, or I don't know, sort of people sort of working in various warehouses or whatever. But nevertheless, everybody had to have a job. One other thing, I mean, yes, you're right in saying that you showed that graph there about how ANO is now incredibly popular, and that is a party. It's not really a party run by this oligarch Babiš, who owns most. Who owns most Czech foodstuffs industry, and actually. He was, as a young man, he was a secret police informer for the Communist Party. Obviously, many people in the Czech Republic don't care because, and he's this kind of populist politicians who's basically offering them more money, maybe to sort of create more deficit or whatever. But I suppose I don't know the reason for this kind of disillusionment of what is it, almost 35% of the people with the current sort of democratic and capitalist whatever regime is that, I suppose, as you rightly pointed it out, is that many people feel insecure and sort of economically poor. I mean, I was just looking today as how it is with housing now, and most people rent. And if you are, if it's actually probably just as bad as Britain, it's very similar. Also, this is why Keir Starmer is kind of being now hated because he's not behaving like the Labour Party at all. So anyway, this thing in this thing that I looked at before I just came out here. If you are a young couple, most people don't own houses. Young people, they rent, like here, right? They pay bloody £900 a month for their house, and they can be turfed out at any moment. If you're the owner of the property, there's no guarantee. They can so it's very insecure. And why would actually people, I don't really understand it. I remember it, communism, right? You obviously not, because you weren't even born, right? Anyway, you didn't live there. It was a disgusting regime. It was really oppressive, right? And I just don't understand how 35 whatever % of the people these days can say that it was better than now. And then sort of 41% say that it's better now than then. But then basically about 59% of the Czech population these days think that it was either better under communism or it's the same as now, right? So I actually don't understand. I was actually mentioning this here as well. I think somehow, maybe is it older people? They're kind of idealizing, also they were young or whatever. They probably just kind of blocked out in their minds that there were certain things that they were not supposed to say or do, and they behaved like kind of sheep. And if you behaved like sheep, then you were rewarded with basically steady job, modest kind of affluence. But, you know, and there is, sorry I'm going on, but there is one interesting thing. I mean, okay, under communism you were not allowed really to discuss political issues, especially anti-communist, in public. You couldn't do philosophy properly. I mean, if you go to one of these housing estates here in Glasgow where 40% are unemployed, if you told them like, you would get a job, but you wouldn't be allowed to discuss philosophy, I think most people don't care about discussing philosophy. They would actually get that. So this is my kind of justification. I don't really understand it, how somebody could now, with hindsight, basically support that regime so badly. But the film shows, this one,
right,
that they feel deprived. Anyway, go on. Sorry.
Right. There's a couple of more stats that I found that I think are quite interesting. So, poverty rate in 2005, which is when the film was aired, 10.4%, which is around average, I think. This one really ties into what was just said. 65% of people said that they have a better standard of living compared to pre-1989. That's a very big number. yeah, it's really interesting, and that kind of ties in what I want to say next. I also I was looking into kind of the state of democracy and like kind of the Czech society as of now, which is maybe a bit off topic, but because since we're like talking about kind of modern day Czechia, it is kind of relevant. There is some people say there is a bit of like democratic erosion. There is definitely a rise in populism, as we saw with like this graph, the black.
That's rubbish. Yes. Oh, yes.
The right wing party was also really like what I found really interesting is the red one and the green one is like the only kind of traditional left wing party.
Yes, you're right. I mean, left of center, right? Those pirates.
Yeah,
okay,
it's not even that left. So that's 10% of the vote, which is almost nothing. So that's really interesting. And I would kind of theorize that perhaps kind of authoritarian values they still maintained within society. We never saw such democratic consolidation, and they kind of manifest themselves now into right-wing extremism instead of left-wing extremism, kind of like a horseshoe theory idea. Anyways, a couple of interesting things about the society now. There's indeed like this Andrzej Babis who has a lot of power in the economy. The state media, or like not per se state media, but media, is really important to understand this kind of trend towards populism. It's definitely very a liberal thing what Babis is writing, what he is proposing. So yeah, this could definitely be seen as like a threat to the Czech state, even though it should be said that he's not right now in government, and also it should be said that I think in 2023 there was a pro-Western prime minister elected. So it deserves some context, it deserves some qualifications, and it's also not a uniquely Czech thing. It's a thing that happens all over Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, like in Poland, in Hungary. This kind of trend is very prominent, and even in Western European countries. But right, that's not particularly what this presentation is about. But it's important to give a bit of context to understand this. So, what does the film really tell us about what it's like living in Czechia? Well, the thing that is probably most prominent and most kind of obvious is the poverty that is showcased in the movie. So this really can be boiled down to small things like there is no food in the fridge, like maybe a bad health, bad state of living conditions, the way so we see in the beginning of the movie that like Tonik is really like he's hungry, and you just the way it's kind of portrayed, you see it's very poor. This is a thing throughout the film, I think. And even though there is such economic hardship, was also really surprising, or not surprising, it's very prominent, is the kind of resilience that they show. So they really try to make a way to making it work. So we see, for example, they try to get some presents for the kids with Christmas, or when Monica needs a house, she moves in with Tonik. Like we see this kind of community, which is very interesting. I think the film kind of plays with a couple of contrasts. So we see this kind of sense of community, kind of trying to take care of each other. Yeah, it also really displays kind of the individual choices being made. Kind of how are we figuring out like how we go about with each other. Another kind of interesting contrast that I already I said, it's like with the older generations versus the new generations, trying to kind of, how do you go about with the insecurity? We see that the older generations are more tied to what they already had. They live in their old houses, and I think they're maybe a bit more old-fashioned. And we see Tonic almost kind of embracing the insecurity, like going to that old farm where it's very shitty, trying to make the best of it, trying to build his own life. We see that personal ambition also in the beginning of the movie, trying to move to the US. We see this interesting contrast, like in the set of the movie, like it's in this old town with like these communist block housing. These are really like remnants of the past. Yeah, so the film really still kind of highlights how the individuals trying to make their own choices, trying to break free. Though it's also obvious, or it seems that they have no guidance, they have no experience how to do so. I think what we can take from this is that freedom is very much a double-sided coin. So on one hand, yes, they have the ability to decide for their own lives, but they don't have the economic security that people used to have. They really have to figure out how to just make things work. And one of the ways this is showcased is just for the fact that the film shows these kind of personal relations. Right. Yeah, and what's really important, or like what's really interesting, is if you compare this film to the films that we have already watched, the ones from the 60s, the 70s, it's not really clear who is the antagonist in this film. Like there's not like a clear enemy, or rather the enemy is kind of within itself. It's like yourself is the enemy. So that it's a really interesting perspective. Like it's very introspective, and really because the film kind of showcases these themes, because it talks about like family relationship, introspective things like intimacy. Like I think that just that really how do you say this? Because the film is so different from the other ones, I think from that we can infer that this is a really different era.
Yes.
So I think I would like to end this by saying, if we take a look at society at large, the Czech society at large, I think we can kind of conclude that it showcases a society that is changing, and it also doesn't really know where to go yet. It has no guidance. And in a way, this is kind of symbolized by the ending of the movie. The ending of the movie, there's no clear ending. We have a lot of questions, such as where does Tonic is? He just went away. We have no idea where the kids are. We have no idea where Monica goes. And the last thing to the film is this train going away, and I think that kind of symbolizes where Czech society was at that point in time, trying to figure out where to go, redefining what it means to be Czech. Redefining what values are important and what to find happiness. I think that's all I want to say.
Thank you very much. And I particularly appreciate all that historical stuff and all those, that was very good. Thank you. I would just add one thing that I keep constantly repeating. Well, in the first way, you actually mentioned it, that here suddenly kind of freedom burst upon the scene. They don't know what to do with it. Yes, they basically suddenly, as you rightly said, there's no outside adversary. The adversary is within them. They have to cope with their lives. They, of course, have material problems. also mental problems, some of them, and they don't know what to do with their lives. And the main kind of, as I said, I think before, the main contrast in this film is between this commercialism and relationships. I mean, you have some characters there, like basically the bloke who sleeps with that girl who's basically mentally ill, and on the other, and the Monica's boyfriend who goes to America to better himself, and then says that he doesn't really want to go back, and this is where kind of this feeling that really genuine relationships and your relationship with your society, with your nation or whatever is important. So that's on that Slama places that on the one hand as a value, and then basically probably thinks that going only for property or for material goods is dehumanizing, that this is maybe, and of course Monica is trying to be with that boyfriend who goes to America, but actually that she's a hybrid character. Then at the end she obviously can't stand it, comes back from America and is looking for Toník, and maybe she will find him, maybe not, but obviously she has sided more with the sort of value of relationships, human relationships. Thank you very much. It was very good. Thank you.
Thanks.
Right. Now I'll use some of the time to talk a little bit about tomorrow's film. So if you let me go there, maybe not terribly long. The film is slightly reverts to the 60s in a way, but in a kind of with a twist, I think, because it's connected with my constant kind of criticism of contemporary Czech society, how apart from these problems that we were just been talking about, highlighted in this film, 20 years old film, Searching for Happiness or whatever by Bohdan Slama, there's also another issue which is, I feel, maybe this is because I'm looking from the outside at it, how they kind of refuse or are incapable, most of them, to look at reality as it is. This film that you will see tomorrow, called Waves, was premiered this year at this Karlovy Vary Film Festival, where I saw it and wrote a little review about it. And it was directed by a 35-year-old kind of actor, Jiří Mádl, who I met somebody at that film festival who works for a theatrical journal, and he said, it looks to me as though Mádl was sent to America and they sent him to some kind of script writing course, because this is a totally American film. It is a hard-hitting film. It is a very good film to watch, and in fact the Czech Republic has now sent it to the Oscars and are hoping to get an Oscar for it, and maybe they will get it because it's a very good film. And the Americans don't understand the context, obviously, who would? And my main sort of issue with it is, now, yeah, go on.
Did they submit it as like best feature film or the best foreign feature?
I don't know.
Oh.
I don't know. You would probably find it somewhere on Google, but interestingly, the film was actually premiered, went to the cinemas, was released to the cinemas around the 15th of August, so it was about 6 weeks after I saw it. And this was around that anniversary of the Warsaw Pact invasion. And one interesting thing is there was this period of liberalization in the 60s, the 60s, from the mid-60s, culminating in that orgy of freedom, media freedom mostly, the Prague Spring, which lasted for several months before the Soviet invasion. And again, currently, the Czech media seem to be unable to grasp or to even inform or to reflect upon that Prague Spring. I suppose went on for 4 months, and anyway it's all forgotten. So whenever there's an anniversary of the invasion, they talk about the Russian invasion, but they never talk about what preceded it and what value that Prague Spring and that these three discussions had. They just talk about, my God, we were sort of invaded, but the context of it is missing. And now, this film is very valuable in the sense that, and I was a sort of teenager, so I actually experienced it. So the film is called Waves. This means radio wave, right? And it kind of wants to bring back, after 50 years, into public consciousness the awareness of the public of these brilliant radio broadcasters who became really famous celebrities, right? Throughout that Prague Spring, but mostly during that invasion week. I actually recorded it on a tape recorder on that day when the invasion came. I still have those recordings, and actually that section in that film where they are broadcasting in the radio building while they're being surrounded by Soviet troops is absolutely dramatic and absolutely authentic. This is good in that film, right? Also, one interesting thing that happened, the Soviet invasion basically failed in that sense that they were unable to silence the free radio, right? The communist regime had some kind of special arrangements because they feared the invasion from NATO, and they basically felt if there's an invasion from the West, we will have these sort of alternative arrangements for radio broadcasting. And this was in place. And when the radio building was actually eventually occupied by the Russian soldiers, these famous broadcasters went into these secret bunkers where there were these anti-Western sort of facilities to continue broadcasting. And the Russians never found it. And these heroic broadcasters for the whole week of that invasion, when then the Czech president went to Moscow or whatever, and or they were actually kind of kidnapped to Moscow, but nevertheless at the end they were left. So basically the invasion, the kind of hot invasion lasted for about a week, from the 21st until about 28th of August, and then everything kind of calmed down and the Russian soldiers withdrew into the countryside or whatever. But this broadcasting was one of the absolutely kind of brilliant sort of sections of sort of Czech life or whatever, Czech history. And that is recorded in that film very well. And as I have checked, because when you talk to young Czechs, they don't remember the names of these famous broadcasters, although now they are kind of highlighted in the film, so maybe they will remember it. When this film went to the cinemas on the 15th of August, it was connected with that anniversary of the invasion, and quite a lot of people flocked to it. And it is really quite interesting. As I'm saying, it is a very good film. People reacted very emotionally to it. Even some people cried in the cinemas, which is really quite weird, right? But so I'm saying it is a hard-hitting film, but why is it problematic? And this is this blindness that they basically have, ideological blindness. That man, Marl, obviously didn't experience it. And the film takes place from September 67 until about a month after the Soviet invasion, September 68. And what it starts with is a student demonstration in September 67. What actually happened, you have a kind of resits at Czech universities in September, or if you don't kind of sit your exams in the spring, you can always leave it until September. So students were preparing for their exams in September, and there were constant power cuts in 67 because the economy wasn't particularly marvelous. And they lived in this hall of residence, which was at the top of the, basically, on a sort of hillside above the city of Prague. And so they got fed up. They took their candles, which they needed to use because there was no electricity, and basically went down into the city center, downhill, holding those candles, chanting, "We want light." And the police interpreted this philosophically, thinking that they mean we want freedom and enlightenment, and so they beat them up. Also, the students didn't know this, the leadership of the Communist Party was in session, and their demonstration kind of went towards where the Communist Party headquarters were, and the police were afraid that they knew this and that they were going to attack the leadership of the Communist Party. So that's why they really quite brutally beat them up. The students didn't know that. And now, the film shows this, but then it creates a kind of absolutely non-historical or anti-historical atmosphere, as though 1967 was like the oppressive Stalinist 50s, which is not the case. I mean, it's an interesting thing that they really sort of highlight the role of the secret police. And the secret police there are two fictitious characters, two young men in it. You will see what they are actually doing with it. I actually think, yes, okay, I was 15, so, but I had two members of my family who were actually imprisoned. Well, they basically killed my uncle in the early 50s. And you saw that video probably of my cousin who's talking about it. They were very small and they were really traumatized by it. And then another member of my family, Catholic priest, was in prison for about 10 years. So I have no reason to actually sort of love the communist regime. But really, in 65, 66, 67, the role of the secret police wasn't like this. And really, basically, this film, creating this notion that kind of it was oppressive in 67 as it had been in 52, is really insulting. I mean, there is this vast literature from the 60s. All these films that we've seen, the anti-communist films, that we wouldn't have been actually able to actually watch them or make them. So all this is actually left out. And it creates this impression, which actually sort of anti-communism is being sort of perpetrated in contemporary Czech Republic. And if it's even taught in schools, this is taught in schools to youngsters, that communism was one 40-year-old black hole of oppression without any distinguishing features. This wasn't true. There were different kind of eras, really, 3 or 4 different ones. Okay, the first 5 years after the communist takeover until 53, until Stalin's death, was really oppressive. Then you had basically maybe 5 or 6 years of absolute stagnation, and then you started having this liberalization. Then you had the Prague Spring, the Soviet invasion, and then you had the 70s and 80s, which was a kind of, I would say, right-wing regime. We know that communism is discredited, but we are really a colony. We, of course, wouldn't say that aloud. You have to praise socialism and being an ally of the Soviet Union and put out the flags and go to your May Day communist demonstrations. If you do that, we'll get, you can have your Skoda cars and your second homes in the country and your color televisions and watch rubbish on television, and that was basic. And this is why, and of course, job security. So you had these felt regimes. So anyway. I'm sorry that in the last film of this series we are going back, of this program, we're going back again to deal with the bloody 60s, but actually it is interesting in the sense that it just shows misinterpretation. And it's interesting, I mean, there is this famous Polish film director, her name is Agnieszka Holland. She actually is a graduate of the Prague Film School, FAMU. And she's had very good contacts with the Czech Republic, and she made a film recently, maybe a couple of years ago, called The Burning Bush. There was a student of the Prague Faculty of Arts who burned himself to death, immolated himself in January 69 in protest of the Soviet invasion. And again, this film was scripted by a 30-year-old who had never experienced it. And again, it kind of creates the notion of that it's, in January 69 you had already communist oppression. This is also rubbish, because it took the sort of occupiers and their collaborators about 18 months to kind of clamp down properly. So the proper clamp down under the Hussák normalization regime didn't come until 1970. So you see, my kind of argument is that they can't even read their own reality properly. One other issue is that Czech Republic, weirdly, but I'd mentioned this before, is absolutely uncritically supporting Israel in its killing of those Palestinians. And in fact, they had the Israeli foreign minister visiting in Prague after this arrest warrant has been issued on Netanyahu. And actually the news that I heard today was that there is a meeting of this of the 190 or whatever signatories of this International Criminal Court going on about the funding, whatever. Human Rights Watch has issued a statement: you have to support this International Criminal Court, because if you only, says our former graduate in a tweet, Andrew Stroline, media director of Human Rights Watch, we keep saying, if you only criticize crimes that are perpetrated by your enemies and not the crimes that are perpetrated by your friends, you're not really criticizing crimes, you're just accepting them. And the Czech government is saying that they want to withdraw funding for the International Criminal Court because they issued a sort of warrant against Netanyahu. So I think that's disgraceful. It is also blindness, like the blindness about what happened in the autumn of '67. What actually happened? Yes, there was that demonstration, student demonstration. The students were beaten up, but actually the Communist Party was really quite decomposed by then. And maybe, I would actually say maybe 80–90% of the communist officials were reformists, pro-democratization. Maybe there were about 10% of hardliners who wanted Stalinists. And in the autumn of '67, that sort of beating up of those students caused a kind of real consternation in the Communist Party, especially comradesses, ladies, were basically saying, this is outrageous, how can the police have beaten up our young people, we're absolutely intolerable. And because people in the Communist Party were not particularly bright, the discussion went on endlessly throughout the whole autumn, until then in late November or early December, maybe something like now, Czech Christmas is incredibly baroque. You have not only the Christmas trees, but also you've got this incredible sort of baroque style Christmas pastry. And all these women are enslaved, and from about kind of late November are at home baking this Christmas pastry. And comradesses were saying, comrades, we can't go on with these discussions, we have to go home and bake our Christmas pastry. So on the basis of this, these discussions were adjourned until after Christmas. On the 5th of January, Alexander Dubček, the reformist leader of the Communist Party, was elected by the Communist Party, and the Prague Spring started. And I think it is connected with that student demonstration, which was suppressed, then the consternation and protest from the Communist Party, which then led to the appointment of Dubček in January '68. And the film, Waves, which we will see tomorrow, kind of doesn't cover this at all. You've got secret police oppression, and then suddenly out of nothing, Dubček arrives in January, so it is slightly crazy. Anyway, do come and have a look at it. It's a good film, and obviously people were crying, but I mean, it reinforced, and it's an interesting question. Some people say, well, it's a work of fiction. Why can't they kind of write their own stuff? Yeah, but it misinterprets events and kind of creates a false consciousness in society, especially when the film is very popular. Any comments?
Sounds exciting.
Thank you very much. We have to go now. 13:50. I have a class in the wisdom of time playing office again somewhere in the bloody middle of nowhere. At least I have the bike here. So anyway, see you tomorrow. And thank you very much for doing this course. You've been great.